Good evening and namaskar to everyone. I am Ayush representing Voices from the Periphery, and it's both profound privilege and a heartfelt honor to welcome you all to today's anticipated lecture on oral history as a tool for social justice. This gathering is particularly significant as we are graced by the presence of one of the most distinguished voices in the field of oral history, Professor Lynn M. Her work has not only shaped the academic landscape of oral history, but has also profoundly impacted the lives of those at the margins of the society. Professor Lewis is a renowned oral historian, educator, and community organizer whose pioneering work bridges the realms of grassroots activism and participatory research. Based in New York City, she has dedicated her life to amplifying the voices of marginalized communities, particularly individuals affected by homelessness and housing insecurity. She holds a Master of Arts in Oral History from Columbia University and a Bachelor of Arts Cultural Studies with a connection in philosophy from the State University of New York. Her academic journey has been firmly grounded in steadfast commitment to social justice and the center of the voices, experiences, and leadership of those often left out in the mainstream narratives. For 17 years, Professor Lewis served as the executive director and civil rights organizer and Picture the Homeless, a groundbreaking organization led by homeless individuals advocating for structural and systematic change, recognizing the vital importance of preserving the memory of such movement. She initiated the Picture the Homeless Oral History Project, a particularly research endeavor that documents the evolution of the organization and the lived experiences of its members. Through this, she has helped reframe the discourse on homelessness, a critical issue, justice, and rights. In academia, Professor Lewis continues to inspire through her role at and faculty at both the New School and Columbia University, where she teaches courses of urban policy, homelessness, and public policy. Her outstanding contribution to oral history and social activism has been recognized through numerous honors, including the prestigious 2022-23 National Endowment for the Humanities Oral History Association Fellowship. Among her publications, the essay "Love and Collective Resistance: Lessons from the Lessons from the issue stands of the testament of the power community storytelling." Her recent book, Women Who Changed the World, Stories from the Plight of Social Justice, with a compelling collection of interviews with 9 extraordinary women organizers, illuminating their courage and transformative work in shaping contemporary social movements. Beyond her remarkable academic and activist accomplishment, Professor Lewis is also a proud mother and grandmother. She finds overall all and each and every aspects of the oral history. It's immense honor to have with us today. Please join me in exciting a warm welcome to Professor Lynn M. Lewis. After you, ma'am.
Thank you for that extremely generous introduction. I don't know if I can live up to all of that, but I will do my best. And I really, really am grateful for you reaching out to me. Voices of the Periphery, obviously the name itself of your organization is something that resonates deeply with me. And so my presentation today, Oral History as a Tool for Social Change, is going to include photos and archival pieces from Picture the Homeless, an organization that was founded and led by homeless New Yorkers, where I worked for 17 years, as you mentioned. And so, orality obviously is about words. And so these are some of the words that kind of came to mind when I received your invitation. And this whole question of who is on the periphery, who is marginalized, who is being marginalized, is all about power. It's about who has power in society. And so I love this quote, that there really is no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And so what is our role as oral historians or any type of historian to correct this imbalance and make sure that history actually does reflect everyone. And so oral history for me is a tool to ensure that all voices and the analysis of each ensures that we are all heard and our voices are honored. An oral history project design allows us to fulfill this goal with intention and transparency. And so I'm going to share the kind of methodology of the Picture the Homeless oral history project, not because I think it's the only way to do oral history. There are many, many approaches to any discipline. And so it really matters what questions are we trying to answer and who do we believe can teach us. And so I, as you mentioned in the introduction, my background is really in community organizing. And as community organizers at Picture the Homeless, we utilize participatory action research. And so I was compelled by the discipline of oral history to document the work of Picture the Homeless, not only through archival work, but also by documenting the perspectives of the leaders and members, former staff, and political allies of the organization. And so oral history and community organizing and participatory action research obviously are not the same thing, but there's a nexus of common values among the three disciplines that I think is important to lift up. And so among the common values are the recognition that every single person has the capacity to analyze the meaning of historic events and the conditions of their own lives. That we must learn from the past to understand the present and create more just futures. And all three are unapologetically rooted in subjectivity and intersubjectivity, in relationship and in orality. And the combination of these three disciplines really does result in a type of knowledge production that perhaps I won't say is not possible otherwise, but that really provides fertile soil. And that is, centering the knowledge of each narrator, the co-creation and shared authority result in a more nuanced and profound research product, that we are able to create resources to engage in collective analysis and collective action to dismantle systems of oppression, including through the creation of popular education materials. The nexus of these three disciplines can help reveal the internal development of an organization or social movement, providing powerful lessons, and as well as revealing the impact of that work. And the reason this is important, even if we're thinking about a small grassroots organization such as Picture the Homeless, is this quote from Howard Zinn, which I also really love. History writing must aim to simply recapitulate the failures that dominate the past is to make historians, us, collaborators in an endless cycle of defeat. And that if history is to be creative, to anticipate a possible future without denying the past, it should, I believe, emphasize new possibilities by disclosing those hidden episodes of the past when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, to join together, and occasionally to win. And so the
Hello, ma'am.
goal...
Hello, ma'am. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt you, ma'am. Ma'am, can you? Your slides are not changing.
Oh,
And
they're
can
not?
you? Yes, ma'am. Can you just click the from current slide option?
Can you see that?
No, ma'am. From current slide option, can you please click that button? Now we can see the only one slide. With that side one here from current slide. From current slide, ma'am.
Okay. So, but will I have to do that for every time I change it?
Yes, ma'am. You have to. No, ma'am. You have to just move the cursor for changing your slides. I just noticed that the slides are not moving, so I
All
thought
right. What do you see now?
the participatory oral history results process.
The goal of the Picture the Homeless Oral History Project. You see that?
No, ma'am. We are saying that participatory oral history research. Yes, sir. We can see now here the goal of Picture of Homeless Oral History Project.
Okay. So we're going to improvise because this is what oral historians are good at doing. So we're improvising. So the goal of the Picture the Homeless Oral History Project, because every research project, right, has a goal, is to identify the conditions that supported the political leadership of homeless New Yorkers and the impact of that work. The core project strategies are to document, preserve, analyze, educate, and inspire. And so throughout the course of the presentation, we'll look at each of those strategies specifically and involve these interconnected elements of 51 long-form oral history interviews. The average is about 2 hours each. We have about 1,600 pages of transcripts, so it's quite a lot of content. We began with longtime members of the organization because we wanted to answer the question, what supported the political leadership of folks? And so we began interviewing folks who were longtime homeless, members of the organization with 10 years or more participation, and who were still active. We created and shared through workshops, popular education materials about our organizing campaigns, but the full audio and complete transcripts, indexed and summarized, are publicly available. We'll see that in a bit. We also preserved the organization's archive and developed archiving strategies that supports the collection being accessible to multiple audiences, as well as for the long term. And so we'll also share what that actually looks like. Did the slide change?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. And so these are the co-founders of Picture the Homeless, Anthony Williams in the top photo, and in the bottom, there's Anthony and Lewis at the time that Picture the Homeless was founded. And you can see from the archive the original mission statement that Lewis wrote by hand while they were staying in a homeless shelter. Picture the Homeless, the tagline is "Don't talk about us, talk with us." And often, I would say almost every single day in New York, there are articles about homelessness and homeless people, which are extremely stigmatizing. And so really kind of assign blame to people for being homeless, as opposed to looking at the cost of housing, the correlation between poverty and the cost of housing, the correlation between poverty and race and gender and other kind of marginalized identities that really conspire to make some people at much higher risk of being homeless than others. And so Picture the Homeless redefines who is fit to lead, movements for social justice, whose knowledge do we need to formulate campaigns to win justice. And so you see the mission statement is really built off of the original statement that these men came up with while they were staying in the shelter. And so what is participatory oral history research? If we're thinking about the nexus of community organizing and participatory action research and oral history, we can identify some practices. In this photo, you see folks, Arvanetta testing out, listening to herself so she knows what she sounds like, to make her feel more comfortable about recording her voice. Charlie Heck, it's important to show people when you were doing interviews, what's going to happen with their interviews? Who's going to hear them? What is the purpose of a project? Marcus Moore here is reviewing a transcript of his first interview to just help jog memory in advance of his second interview. That was important to him. And then in this bottom slide, you have members of the advisory board that was formed in the beginning of the project in 2017, reviewing some of the popular education materials. We were in the room of an advisory board member who was very ill. And so we went and had our meetings in his room over the course of several months so that he could continue to participate. And so these are some of the considerations when we think about participatory, is who do we want to be able to participate and what do we need to do in order to make that participation accessible? Okay, sorry. So these are a lot of words. I'm glad we're recording so that you'll have them. These are suggestions based on our own practice, but this is not a list, a comprehensive list of everything that someone else must do in a different project. But some of the things I will just highlight is that engagement, participation in any type of research happens over a period of time. And that therefore, folks' participation can change over time. Folks can participate in thinking through the purpose of a project, who should be interviewed, where interviews can take place, and make suggestions, but perhaps that's where their participation is somewhat limited, either by their own life circumstances or their own interests. Collaboration is something that could be a little deeper in terms of not only thinking about who might need to be interviewed for a project, for an oral history project, but helping to reach out to them, helping to explain what the project is about. So kind of similar task, but taking on deeper responsibility and accountability. Shared authority would mean joint decision-making, at least around one aspect of the project, and co-creation could mean shared authority around all aspects of the project. But over the period of time, this project was about 6 years. 6 years is a long time. We experienced COVID during that period. Some of the advisory board members passed away during this period. People's life circumstances change. And so we want to be as inclusive as possible and acknowledge that folks' participation might be fluid, and that is okay, and that is fine, and that is welcomed, because the changes in our life circumstances can also inform the research process. So by maintaining fluidity, we're able to keep people engaged. We're able to maintain inclusivity. So things like collective transcript review, reviewing the archive. I hosted events here in my apartment, cooking food. We got together. People picked up transcripts that they wanted to read. People made notes on them. We uploaded them to Google Docs for people that had internet access and facility with Google Docs, so they could make comments on transcripts about, for example, follow-up questions that they would like to know more about, things that they thought were important, things that represented themes. Other folks did not have access to internet, so therefore not Google Docs. So we purchased flash drives and downloaded them. So we figured out all kinds of tools, all kinds of practices for the folks that we wanted engaged in the project. So it really depends on who is participating in your project and what kinds of practices you need to develop. A lot of the skills that folks brought to this project came from organizing and conducting participatory action research together. So you see in the photo, we're sitting around the table. This was pre-COVID in a church basement that one of the advisory board members had access to. And we listened to audio together. We reviewed transcripts. We talked about what themes were bubbling up. But we had a practice of already engaging in analysis together. And so one question is, how do we create a culture where people feel comfortable, maybe not disagreeing, but even seeing things differently, which is a good thing, bringing in different visions and different analysis. And so these are all examples of transferable skills and practices that we were able to bring into this project. However, keep in mind that skills and knowledge may also transfer or translate to power hierarchies within a project. So paying attention to those things. Who feels comfortable speaking up? Who maybe feels silenced, even within a community of which they're a member? Acknowledging our own power and privilege in our role as oral historian, eliminating jargon, making the archive visible. So we would tape up around this very large basement, press clippings and things that we wanted to discuss. We created systems of accountability for people that were part of the advisory board. We decided we needed an onboarding process of orientation. What is this about? What do we mean by accountability? What are the different tasks that folks are invited into? What training might people feel they need to be able to do that work? All of these types of things. Being transparent about funding for a project, being realistic about the time this work takes, and the emotional labor needed. But it's very important to identify milestones and celebrate our progress. Over a 6-year period, it can seem very daunting and even overwhelming, and you wonder if you're ever going to be finished. And so it's very important to celebrate these milestones. And so one of the really important, I think, accomplishments of the advisory board was bringing a thematic analysis collectively to what we were hearing and what we were reading. And we were able to identify overarching themes. Now, it's not surprising that people involved with an organization over such a long period of time who were still active shared a sense of values and analysis. That's why they're still there. And so there were overarching themes that were very strong, and we grouped them into 2 categories. And remember, our research question was, what were the conditions within the organization that supported people's leadership? And so we identified 7 pillars of Picture the Homeless's organizing methodology: being welcoming, the fact that it was homeless people that represented the organization, which also spills into oral history as a strategy to document the work, education within the organization, as well as public education, homeless leadership in coalition spaces and movement spaces, collective resistance, so direct actions, and the relationships that are formed through resistance, and this overall question of not only identifying problems, but solutions that speak to justice. All the interviews also contain themes of individual resistance, of race, and of the system. So there are stigmatizing narratives, as I mentioned before, in our mainstream media that actually provide cover for dehumanizing public policies. So from the archive, There were, when Picture the Homeless started, there were, as always, to this day, these are the types of headlines in our newspapers. Violent crazies, public pests, as if people are insects, lowlifes, beggars. And so these stigmatizing narratives provide cover. And this is an example where you see the finest message. This is a memo from the New York City Police Department from 2016 after Picture the Homeless members filed a lawsuit after the police destroyed their property. They created this category called hotspots. So encampments, erecting a cardboard box to sleep in is illegal in New York. Erecting a tent or a larger kind of encampment where you have a collection of these things is already illegal in New York City, and you can be fined or arrested for that. But hotspots, as you can see, their definition are outdoor locations where two or more individuals are gathered without a structure. That just means two people standing on a sidewalk talking about where they're going to eat. Now, if this memo was written by the NYPD and mentioned any other category of people besides homeless, it would be a civil rights violation. If it was two South Asian, two young people, two women, to any kind of status, that would be illegal. But it's permissible because of the stigmatization of folks who are homeless. Now, what the interviews do, and we don't have time to play audio in this presentation, but what these interviews do is they breathe life into the archive. James, Dr. Floyd Parks, the other names you see here are all leaders of the Picture the Homeless Civil Rights Campaign. And they talk about what those actions, the impact those actions have on them. And they also talk about the power of resistance. So in this photo, Trash and Bash, Floyd was one of the people that filed a lawsuit. We were able to connect him with an attorney, and he and two other people successfully fought a lawsuit against the city for destruction of property. And so what that meant to him and the organization, we hear in their voices and in their analysis through the process of recording oral history interviews. And so, as I mentioned, we have 51, 50 are published interviews. Now, when you're conducting oral history, one of the questions is, oh, well, this is so subjective, and, you know, everybody is biased, and how do you know it's true? And so because we have such a robust archive, it doesn't matter. If someone says, this happened in 2010, maybe it happened in 2009 or in 2012. But what oral history so powerfully does is it adds nuance to the historic record. It allows us, for example, to research the archive. If we want to make a timeline of events, we certainly can. But what those events mean to people is what you capture through oral history, as well as details like who else was there, what planning went into that event, what resulted from that work. And so we started thinking about the Oral History Project as a memory quilt, that each interview is legitimate, that each person's analysis, because remember, an oral history interview not only contains facts, but also contains an analysis of those facts. And so it's basically a collective memory of 2 decades of organizational and movement building. Each person's memories and the meaning they assign to them matter. Collectively, they form a quilt that embodies the organizing methodology of the group. No one person can tell the history of anything. And so thinking about history and documentation collectively is something we're striving to do with this project. Now, I'll go through these kind of quickly. There's photos from the archive as well as quotes. So some of the actions that we did were reclaiming public space. James Doctor here, his nickname's Doc. One of the biggest things I learned being involved with Picture the Homeless was unity. You all showed everybody together we can accomplish so much more than one person standing out there trying to fight a war against 1,000. It's not going to happen. We educated the public through public art. We worked with other groups here to conceptualize a Know Your Rights with the Police mural with an artist who was amazing. She was able to listen to and follow the leadership of folks who were experiencing police violence. Sean Lynn, a quote from his interview, the mural was not only like we're getting together to talk and study and then put up an end product of a mural. It was also a meeting space and an opportunity to continue to have conversations with folks. We passed legislation. We passed the first in the United States, a local law that added housing status to a list of statuses like race, gender, migration status, and others to prohibit the police from profiling people based on their housing status, the first in the United States. And so you see this photo of the back of someone, Ryan. We were there at 2 a.m. when the bill was passed. And you can see the Picture the Homeless blue banner in the bottom. Through doing that work, we inserted and educated the movements in New York City who worked on ending police violence, that there was also the question of violence towards people who were unhoused, who were homeless. We started looking at very early on, I would say the beginning of the organization, around the proliferation of vacant buildings. So New York, real estate is a huge driver of the economy here. And so what is up with all these vacant buildings? These are vacant apartments. And so you hear Marcus Moore in one of his interviews state actually two policy problems. Where do you want me to go? You're not building nothing for me, but I can't be nowhere. And I can't be nowhere speaks to police harassment. And then a solution from Picture the Homeless members was every time we talk with the homeless, the first thing they say is, what about all these abandoned buildings? Why don't we just fix them and move people in? You've got more abandoned properties than homeless people. And so if you are a real estate developer, you might see a vacant building and think about, you can renovate it, you could tear it down and build something else, and you can make money off of it. Whereas if you don't have an apartment and you see a vacant building, what you might see is a place where you could live if the building was fixed up. And so we started working on shifting the narrative about what the meaning of vacant buildings and vacant lots actually are. Converting stories of oppression where people are portrayed as victims, as the object of pity, or to be feared. We started converting those into acts of resistance by suggesting solutions to these problems that are actually created by our economic system. We did street theater and started reframing the narrative that it's not a homeless crisis, it's a housing crisis. And there are many people that are subject to harm by the way that our system produces and manages housing. So not only homeless people, but many, many, many people in New York City cannot afford housing, make tremendous sacrifices to be able to pay rent. And so linking the struggles of people who are homeless with other people in the city who would benefit from a change in policy. And so we started thinking about homeless people, homes without people, and people without homes, and giving walking tours of whole city blocks where you can see in the photo, these apartments are boarded up, sometimes bricked up, and in many cases have been that way for decades. And so what that means, asking people to look up and to think about that, having demonstrations where we're illustrating the amount of money being paid for homeless services, as opposed to what's being invested in housing, not just for homeless people, but for all working class people. We engaged in participatory action research so we could back up what we were saying, disrupting narratives and identifying solutions. And so in this report, which we released in 2012, that's just a snapshot of the executive summary, but banking on vacancy, homelessness, and real estate speculation. So we reframed the problem from there's not enough housing and it's too expensive to, well, actually, there's plenty of housing that's available. And New York City is spending literally billions of dollars a year on managing a homeless service system where people are actually trapped in many ways because they can't afford to secure housing and leave. And we identified 199,981 potential units of housing. We did this in conjunction with the City University of New York at Hunter College, their Department of Community Development. And so Picture the Homeless was a political home for unhoused folks. And we used a combination of strategies. Our theory of change was homeless leadership and representation, a leader full organizing model, participatory action research, educating ourselves, public education, coalition building, direct action and civil disobedience, media work, and legislation. So all of these were happening, not necessarily all on the same day at the same time, but were part of our overall strategies. And so participatory oral history research, we talked about some of the process. And so we're going to talk about the impact. So as we explore where we are and where our oral history projects are, where do they exist in a landscape of social change? So often oral historians talk about co-creation and shared authority within an interview, in being aware of and intentional about power and privilege, those dynamics in an interview process, or even in a project itself. But how can our oral history projects contribute to social change out in the world? What are the ways that our oral history projects can shift power and privilege in society? So being welcoming was one of the themes that we identified. This was us at a demonstration in front of the state office building in New York City. Clearly, it's an organized demonstration. There's our banner, but we did many sidewalk sleepouts like this. And so offering trainings to folks who are organizing around this concept of being welcoming. What does that look like in different settings for different populations? We created audio clips and zines for each of our organizing campaigns. Not, again, that people need to copy these things, but to share ideas. We use these concepts in oral history and community organizing trainings. This is a group in another city that is homeless-led that invited us to share some organizing lessons around outreach. And so you see here the origin story. One of the things that we heard over and over in the interviews around representation is that it was very important for people connected to Picture the Homeless that it was homeless people speaking to the media, that it was people who were homeless going to coalition meetings, and that for many of them, the origin story that Picture the Homeless was founded by two homeless men was very powerful. That's one of the reasons they came to Picture the Homeless when they heard that. So sharing with this group in Baltimore around the power of your origin story, that everybody knowing what that is, that we share that. Also connecting and amplifying other forms of grassroots research. There's not only one way to do oral history or any type of research. So placing ourselves in this larger field was very important. And then making skill shares. So Andres here is talking about how he does outreach. He's a member of Picture the Homeless doing outreach. And then Charmel actually is someone that Andres went to her shelter and met her and her husband and invited them. And so pairing people's experiences together so that you can see how they're complementary. And as I mentioned earlier, multiple entry points through archiving. So the zines are wonderful. Popular education is wonderful. But if something happens, we're not going to live forever, right? And so we want this collection to be available after we're long gone. And so one strategy, in addition to popular education, is partnering with an archive that has the capacity to preserve and make accessible this collection. And so this is in my apartment. Shannon O'Neill from NYU Tamament. They have a tremendous archive of all kinds of collections, but a lot of housing groups are archived there. So it was important to us that if people didn't even know about us, they could stumble upon us there, that we are placing this collection in that broader ecosystem. But if people do know about us, they can find us there way into the future. And we have a website. So the collection is also part of the Housing Justice Oral History Project. And here's a QR code so you can scan it. I don't know how our tech is going to work for me to show it to you, but you can scan it. And so I hope I didn't talk too fast, and I wanted to leave time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing. And here we are.
Thank you, ma'am. It's really wonderful, and what can I say? It's truly, truly wonderful, ma'am. The initiation and the work you've done and the organization has done. It's truly wonderful. So now I will start the Q&A session, question answering session. I'll ask our audience if they have any questions, they can unmute themselves and they can directly ask to ma'am. And for our YouTube visitors, they can post their questions in the YouTube comments. I will read out the questions for them. So if they have any questions, they can please unmute themselves and ask directly to ma'am, or they can also write in the chat box so that I can just read out those questions. But first, I will ask some questions from our YouTube channel. So, ma'am, can I ask those questions? Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes. No, I don't think I'm on mute. Yes, you may.
Okay. So, ma'am, the first question is asked by Arnav Rothit. He's asking that in your work with oral histories of housing struggles and queer community resistance in New York City, you foreground narrative as a counter-hegemonic force. But how do you reconcile the ethical contradictions between amplifying subaltern voices and the inherent risk of epistemic extraction when institutions, particularly elite academic ones, mediate those oral histories? Is there a danger that the archive itself becomes a tool of containment rather than liberation?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking that. I would say there's always a risk, but if we don't amplify those voices, then they remain silenced in mainstream discourse. Now, voices are never silent, right? People, however marginalized people are, they are talking, they are communicating, but who is hearing them? And so I think that oral history offers a powerful way for folks to represent themselves. Picture the Homeless also, keep in mind that is an organization where people who are homeless have already used their agency and made a decision to speak publicly. So the Oral History Project in many ways is an extension of that mission. And if these oral histories didn't exist, then they would not be heard from. And so there is always that risk of extraction, but we can design our projects to be non-extractive. People were very clear about where this was going to live. For example, a digital archive, popular education materials, and at a longer term archive. People were very clear about that, and felt that that was a powerful contribution that they could make as individuals in setting the record straight. And so you would hear that a lot. You would hear people say, this is for the record, or this is so other people can learn the truth about what's happening. And so I think that it makes a difference when you're working with an organization or with people that have already made that decision to be public, as opposed to just finding people and saying, oh, here, I want to interview you, and they have no connection to a larger kind of mission and goal. I wouldn't say don't do that, but I would say there's more of a danger of extraction and alienation if folks are not already in community together.
Thank you, ma'am. And now the second question that is asked by Raki Mondol. She is asking that, ma'am, you mentioned in your lecture the COVID-19 period. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when physical presence and communal spaces were disrupted, how did oral historians like yourself ethically navigate the translation of intimacy, trust, and trauma across digital interfaces? Can remote oral history practice truly uphold the radical rationality and embodied solidarity that your methodology demands? Or has the pandemic revealed the limits of oral history in a disembodied, surveillance driven world?
Thank you for that. And thank you for mentioning surveillance, because I don't think we talk enough about the danger that people who are already subject to state violence are experiencing when they stand up to speak for themselves, whether it's through oral history or through any kind of protest. For example, we're certainly seeing this now in the US with students that are involved in protesting or even writing opinion letters to a student newspaper. And so to get to the first part of the question, COVID hit us very hard. In New York, we were one of the first place in the States to experience mass death. And so it was terrifying. Some of the narrators of the Picture the Homeless Oral History Project worked to keep the office open, so that people had a place to go to use the bathroom. Many businesses, restaurants, all these places closed down, and we do not have public restrooms in New York. And so people had nowhere to go. They were being driven into the public shelter system. Even the subways closed down at night because of COVID, which is a place where people often sleep on the trains and the buses. And so the public shelter system that people are being pushed, herded like cattle into, did not have a place to socially distance. So there were photos, for example, of people just all pressed up together, waiting for intake, to be intaked in the shelter system, which is the opposite of what we were all advised to do. You cannot stay 6 feet apart if you are being herded into a congregate shelter. The cots that people were staying on were just inches apart. And we were hearing from allies that worked for the city that they were telling their outreach workers, don't give homeless people hand sanitizer and masks, tell them to go into the shelter system. And so we created a campaign called Homeless Can't Stay Home, because everybody was being told to stay home. But if you don't have a home, you can't stay in a home you don't have. And so it was a tremendous crisis. And some of our folks passed away during that time or became very, very ill. And so we paused having our meetings around the Oral History Project. It became very difficult. We were able to have some Zoom meetings because many people, even folks who are homeless, have cell phones, often given by the state through like our Medicaid system. And so we were able to have some Zoom calls, but they became really about what's happening now, not what happened in the past, right? It would have been ridiculous to just insist, oh no, we have to talk about transcripts or this or that. And none of us were there, myself included. We were all overwhelmed. So we stayed in touch that way. And I think that the staying in touch, the relationship aspect, the relational aspect of oral history is really crucial. And as I mentioned, over the course of any research project, things happen in people's lives. COVID is an extreme example, but in other cases, it could be people start a job, people have a baby, all these things happen, and it affects our ways that we need to participate and adjust to one another's realities. The question of remote interviewing, some of the interviews I did remotely during that period. It helped that we know each other. It would be much more challenging to interview someone remotely if you don't know them. I do think it's possible, and I can speak to that. But you don't see someone's whole body. You're not able to read their body language in the same way. One interview I did with a woman while she was in her shelter, she was in her bathroom in her shelter, and the interview was about 3.5 hours long. And she was on her cell phone, and so all I could see was her face. The internet connection wasn't great, so the audio isn't as good as doing an in-person recording with a nice recorder. Was it still valuable? Yes. It gave her an opportunity to share what she wanted to share. And so from a technical perspective, in terms of audio quality, it's not as good. From a human perspective of her having the opportunity to share her experience and her analysis of our work together, it was just as important. In terms of surveillance, again, these are people who already made the decision to be public. And so often members of Picture the Homeless, for example, the police sometimes would see members of Picture the Homeless who they knew from panhandling and having harassed them. Once they knew they were members of Picture the Homeless, it gave them a certain safety. Because if you're connected with an organization, then you're not alone. And so sometimes being public gives you safety that being anonymous doesn't give you. So there's benefits and challenges, I think, for both. I see a question here. Should I answer that one now?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. I can read out the question for you, ma'am. Dr.
Okay.
Jester asked the question that how long you go back in history in your interviews? What is the historical injustice that caused for the homelessness problem?
Okay. So thank you for that question. Um, we used a life history approach in the oral history interviews. Um, so people were able to share where they come from, anything they wanted. Their, oral history, of course, you're asking open-ended questions. And so people are able to kind of drive the narrative and share what they want to share as much as they want to share. So where are you from? Tell me things you want to share about your family. Um, what were some of the influences in your early life? Are there, things, are there experiences that you've had that were important to you that you want people to know about? So people, for example, shared when they learned that they were a good singer, shared memories of their grandparents or their parents that were formative in terms of shaping them. There's a huge correlation in the US between race and poverty and gender. So often people, before they become homeless, already have an analysis of kind of their social location based on race or based on gender or migration status or sexual orientation or identity and all of these, right? Faith, religion. And so people were able to kind of tell us who they were as people uh, before they became homeless. And of course, when you become homeless, that adds to your experience as a human being, but it doesn't define your experience. And one of the things we learned through doing these life history interviews is that many people, before they came to Picture the Homeless, already had a strong sense of justice and injustice. And so when they became homeless, they saw homelessness within that context of, well, this isn't right. It's not right that there are all these vacant buildings. It's not right that the police are walking up to me saying, you can't be here. You cannot be in this park. And so I think the oral history, this life history approach was very powerful for the Picture the Homeless Oral History Project. Again, some people shared more than others, and that's their right. And that's our obligation to them as oral historians, is to invite them to share. I think the historic injustice that caused for the homeless problem is really about wealth and poverty. And the fact that we in the US, housing is not a right. Housing is not a human right in the US. It is a commodity. And so in a place like New York, you have extremely high rents, and home ownership in many neighborhoods is actually quite low. In the neighborhood I live in, at one point, it was 7% of the people in this neighborhood owned their apartments. And again, this is apartment living, not houses. I live in Manhattan in East Harlem. And so that means 93% are renters. And so there's a patchwork of programs. There's public housing, but certainly there's an over 10-year waiting list to be able to move into public housing. And so I think the historical injustice that causes the homeless problem is that it's not a right. It's a way to accumulate wealth. It's a commodity that's traded. Many of these vacant buildings, we learned, were not owned by individuals. They were owned by banks. They were owned by corporations, international corporations, that hold on to real estate as part of a portfolio, an investment portfolio. And so I think that's the historical injustice. And that's part of the educational process that we went under, is counting these vacant buildings and lots, doing these reports, sleeping outside of them, And when people walk by, so, what is this about? And you say, well, look up. There's 30 homeless people sleeping in front of this building. This building has 50 apartments and they're empty. Is that right? And really trying to reframe that question and how we look at property was a tremendous learning that we did together and that we were able to share with others. And out of that work, we were able to pass legislation to mandate that the city inventory vacant property. There is an anti-warehousing coalition because we started talking about property and housing being warehoused, just like any other commodity. And is that right? Does that make sense in terms of public policy and the common good? So, and then the next question, I don't know if you want to read it.
Yes, I will read the question. It's asked by Professor Patnaik. He's asking that oral narratives are multiple by nature. Oral narratives of resistance and oral narratives of subordination and so on. What methods may be useful to discover both the dimensions?
That's a wonderful question. Also, I love all these questions. I think when we ask open-ended questions, even within one answer, we hear narratives of resistance and subordination, because often the resistance is to the subordination. So they're in dialogue with each other. What people are resisting is what they believe is their oppression, right? And so these things are intertwined. And at Picture the Homeless, one of the things that was important to people is not to identify band-aid solutions, but to understand the root causes of problems. And so people formed study groups. And in terms of police, for example, learned about the founding of this country, and the role of the police was really to protect property and property owners, to the extent that police were used to hunt down enslaved people who had escaped. Our federal government passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which empowered police, although they were already empowered to do this, and individuals to hunt people down as property. And so people know these things, right? These are things that, based on family stories, based on little glimpses that you read in your history books or what you're taught in school, that you interrogate further, people understand the causes of their own subordination. But it's through the collective process of organizing that everybody's knowledge together allows us to understand something in a deeper way, or identify, well, what do we need to learn about this? And so subordination and resistance go together. And I think that the process of oral history, the kind of open-ended dialogic nature of the interviews, allows us to surface how those go together. With our project design, we welcomed people to have additional interviews. And so, once you interview someone, as those of you who've done interviews know, when you listen to it again or transcribe it or read it, you hear things that you didn't hear during the interview. And so maybe identifying additional questions to go deeper. And also when people receive their interview transcript and the audio, they can read it or think about it, or even the next day after they've had their interview, things pop into their mind like, oh, I didn't say this, or I forgot to say that. And so offering people additional opportunities to be interviewed allows you to explore some of these questions in a deeper way.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we will take the last question. And it's asked by Shijoni, that she's asking that Homi Bhabha's theory of the third space destabilizes fixed binaries between colonizer and colonized, authority and resistance. Given your work in documenting urban struggles and disposition, do you see oral history as capable of generating this in between space of negotiation, or does it risk essentializing the community voice as static, noble, and politically instrumental? Is there a danger of collapsing hybridity into coherence for activist aims?
It would help me to understand the question if you would type it in so I could read it, because I want to make sure that I'm answering it.
Okay. Just give me 1 minute.
Yes, I want to properly answer that question. One thing that I will say while that is happening is that oral history, back to this theory of change. Here we go. By
Yes,
itself. Okay. All right. Let me see it. I thank you for this question, and thank you for typing it in for me, because I wanted to get it. I wanted to get it right. I think oral history is about generating in between space of negotiation. Anything can essentialize a community voice as static, and knowable and politically instrumental. There's a wonderful book about oral history called Curating. Oh my God, I'm going to go get the book it's by Sujanta Fernandez. And it's about how sometimes people's oral histories or just their experience can be used to fuel, for example, a political campaign that takes part of their story as kind of ammunition, but that kind of flattens their whole story and perhaps is used to achieve some type of change that people don't even necessarily fully believe in. So I think that risk is always there. But I do think that oral history is a way to create this in-between space of nuance. Activists, I think we all run the risk of wanting to win things, wanting to change things, and seizing upon a quote or an experience or a case study, and generalizing it, or using it for what we, with good intentions, are hoping to achieve. And so we have to be very careful, but it is important to make sure that these narratives, this analysis, because again, people talk about storytelling, but I think of it as history telling, that we can be so afraid of harm that we don't do anything. And so making popular education materials allows us to frame the meaning. But making sure, when we started doing these zines, these popular education materials, we said to ourselves, well, we are also in this way curating someone's voice. And so creating these materials are helpful to get it out in a way that is very accessible. But it was very important to make sure that people had access to the full transcript so that we weren't just filtering what someone wanted to say. And so I think there's some things we can build in, but there always is that risk.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for one wonderful session. I hope and I wish your organization will work more and more and better. And your work is truly inspiring for us also. We was from the periphery are also inspired by your organization. I read about your organization in your work in Times and so other newspapers. So thank you, ma'am, for joining us, for enriching us about your goals and what will our initiative be in our next days. So thank you, ma'am, for your presence and for delivering a lecture in our forum. And thank you, ma'am, for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and I hope we stay in touch.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.